I've had time. A few days ago, as I did with every single time a new Jujutsu Kaisen chapter came out, I, using the leaks that come out a couple of days before the official release, did a breakdown of what I thought about chapter 271 of JJK. Now, usually the way that the leaks in the Jujutsu Kaisen community worked is that there was a guy by the name of Miyamura on Twitter who get the raw scans of the Shonen Jump magazine and translate them in a matter of hours. However, because Miyamura decided that in the last week of JJK ever being released, that he was going to go on a pilgrimage with his mother, which I respect, Go Off King, the leaks community was in absolute shambles, and thus all we really got when it came down to the leaks of JJK chapter 271 was 6 or 7 pages that were anything but well translated. And for those of you who are saying, well then Nick, why didn't you just wait until the official release to do your chapter review? If I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times on YouTube. If you are not first, you are last. However, because I was using incredibly shoddy leaks, my perception of the final chapter of JJK skewed in a more negative way than I now currently believe. See, because here's the thing. The final chapter of JJK is not good. Even now, after reading the official release, I believe it to be still one of the biggest fumbles in manga history. However, now that I've read the official release and seen some things that weren't even included in the leaks, I do absolutely feel differently about the ending of this story. See, because the blame for the poor ending of JJK does not fall entirely on the shoulders of chapter 271. Chapter 271 is a symptom of the greater disease that plagues the ending of this story. In actuality, 271 isn't that bad, but the disease that was Gege's complete and utter ignorance to anything that his fans wanted was the real reason that chapter 271 caught as much flack as it did. And thus today, now that I've had some time to chew on it, I want to talk about chapter 271 of JJK. I want to talk about the ending of JJK. I want to talk where Gege went right and where he went wrong. What he was smart for adding and what he missed entirely. Because while there are a lot of things wrong with the ending of JJK, there's also some pretty beautiful moments. Some full circles that are completed, some messages that are passed on, some themes that are closed out quite nicely. So, like with so many of our JJK chapters of olds, I'm not quite sure how to feel. But then again, just like you, I'm just starting this video myself. So with no further ado, let's get into my final thoughts on Jujutsu Kaisen. But before we get to breaking down JJK's ending, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you want to see me try to bring real-life challenges to the anime world, go ahead and follow the brand new channel that I created with Stephen Heat, Chris Barnett, and Danny Mata called Anime IRL. Or if you just want to hear me talk about anime and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything happening in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. But before we get into all that, today we got to talk about a brand new sponsor to the page, Grunes. Grunes wants to make hitting your nutritional goals easier. How many of you out there are taking multiple supplements a day? Or how many of you feel like you should be taking multiple supplements a day? Well, fortunately, because of Grunes' comprehensive and convenient formula, which is neither a multivitamin, a greens gummy, or a probiotic, but instead all three of those things wrapped into one fantastic package, is not only going to give you all the nutrition you would get from taking those multiple supplements, but also give it to you at a fraction of the price. On top of that, they taste great. See, honestly, every single day I look forward to my packet of Grunes because they taste about as good as any gummy bear on the market. But they also help me with my gut health, my energy, and my cognition. In fact, if I don't take my daily Grunes before I film a video, I feel like I'm filming in slow motion. And I absolutely adore that it's 8 gummies per pack. 1, it feels like a snack, and 2, I feel like we preserve the flavor this way. On top of that, Grunes are vegan, nut-free, dairy-free, and gluten-free. And they provide 20 plus vitamins per pack, while your standard multivitamin only offers 7 to 9. And they're able to achieve that because over 60 whole food ingredients go into every pack of Grunes. And they achieve this level of flavor with only 3 grams of added sugar. And they also offer a sugar-free option, all with no artificial colors or flavors. And if you're going on a road trip for a couple of days, or you're gonna be out of town and away from your Grunes pack, well, fortunately, they're easy to travel with. On top of that, they're HSA and FSA eligible for reimbursement. So what are you waiting for? Get up to 45% off your Grunes today using the link in my description. It's time nutrition started tasting good. So, one of the biggest misconceptions revolving around the leaks when they were leaking is that this chapter was only in the region to 6 to 10 pages long, as really the only pages we got were the first 5 to 6 pages, the Gojo flashback, and the last 2 pages. Obviously, this was inaccurate. There was 21 pages of this last chapter of JJK. However, only 6 to 7 of these pages are worth anything. See, the first 13 pages of this 21-page chapter are dedicated to a D-tier mission that Team Gojo was on really for no particular reason. Meaning that in this final chapter of JJK, there's really only 8 pages dedicated to trying to close out this incredibly complex and beautiful story. Now, there is technically a reason that you would dedicate 13 pages of your final chapter to a D-tier mission, and that is to show the audience that, look, I know things got crazy for a while there, but these are high schoolers we're talking about. Yuji, Nobara, and Megami, as the kids that they are, should be protected by the adults of society. And this is a through line that runs through the epilogue. When both Yuji and Megami try to apologize to all of the adults that are presiding over Yuta's resuscitation, they're firmly shut down as they're told that the adults in the room are really the ones who are to blame. And this is really a through line throughout the entirety of JJK. For as long as Jujutsu high schools have existed, the students of those high schools have been thrust into situations much too dangerous for students and sorcerers of their level. And this is why Geto and Gojo had to deal with the loss of so many friends. The continuance of this cycle, allowing children to fight the battles of adults, perpetuates a system that effectively leads lambs to a slaughter. And thus, when it really comes down to it, what Yuji, Megami, and Nobara should be doing is minor missions like this. Trying to find a sorcerer who, out of the resentment in his heart, is trying to curse a woman who doesn't remember who he is. Not having your body taken over by the King of Curses, getting your face exploded by a guy who's able to augment souls, or being forced to grapple with the realization that you may have to kill your friend to save the world. These are, after all, kids. But is there a way to do that more effectively than Gege decided to? I'm gonna have to say yes. See, because 13 pages of the final chapter of this story being dedicated to the storyline isn't even the entirety of how long introducing and wrapping up this storyline took. It also took 4 pages from chapter 270 to introduce this problem, meaning that in total, from the less than 40 pages of the last 2 chapters of this story, 17 of those pages are dedicated to hunting down a sorcerer whose name we never learn. And while a fair amount of those pages are dedicated to Megami and Yuji and Nobara messing around so everybody knows that they're happy and friends still, a fair amount of the dialogue across these 17 pages are the likes of Team Gojo planning on how to catch the sorcerer. And while this obviously makes opportunities for levity to show that Team Gojo is congealed back together as one unit, it also shows us something that Gojo talks about in his flashback, that the kids are gonna be all right. See, because even though Yuji and Nobara spend the majority of the time that Megami is actually planning on how to catch this sorcerer messing around, and by the end of their chase, Yuji and Nobara have done effectively nothing and Megami's done all the work, that's kind of always been the dynamic that occurred in Team Gojo. And yet they were still able to, in the face of what some would deem a difficult job, get the job done. And thus, these 17 pages of this seemingly non-important storyline introduce the concept that normalcy has returned to the world. Now, is this how I would go about it? No. You can convey the fact that normalcy has returned to the world in many ways that don't require 20 pages of somewhat useless dialogue. In fact, I think MHA did a really good job of showing normalcy returning to the hero world when, after the defeat of the big and final baddies, we got to see things like Class 1A become Class 2A, and Class 2A become Class 3A and graduate. We got to see what Deku did with the embers of One for All. And while a lot of people didn't like the last chapter of MHA with the time skip and all of that, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about restoring normalcy, something that could have been done in a somewhat similar fashion in the JJK work. If you want to see normalcy return, you could have just as easily had Team Gojo having to go to jujutsu classes, them getting a new teacher from the cast of people that could have been picked, Hana and other possible awakened sorcerers from the Culling Games joining the Jujutsu Academy and possibly joining Team Gojo, or even treating the final mission of JJK as Team Gojo popping over to America to get Remy back. Something that you probably could have accomplished in 20 pages if we're being real. And then not only would we have closed out a needlessly opened storyline, but we could also, during these 20 or so pages, give some closure to the existence of the Culling Games. The Culling Games that kind of ended, but also kind of didn't. But then some of you more accomplished and better readers are asking the question, but the mission that Team Gojo goes on touches on a lot of the themes of the story, and the way that it concludes is meant to be a send-off to Gojo in a sense. And you're right. It is. See, even though Gojo's only in 2 or 3 pages of the final chapter, a lot of the subcontext of the final chapter revolves around Gojo. Not as much as fans would like, but still a fair amount. But what do I mean by that? Well, even those with borderline no reading comprehension can understand the fact that after the no-name sorcerer is caught by Team Gojo, Yuji tells him to buck up, telling him he won't get the death penalty. But when the no-name sorcerer tells him he doesn't know how he's going to recover from this because he has no idea how to show his compassion for others without blaming them, Yuji launches into a flashback with Gojo, where Yuji is having his final conversation with Gojo that served in replacement for a letter that Nobara and Megami got, where Yuji's saying, I figured the second person that I would switch with after Kusakabe would be you, Gojo-sensei, and not Yuta. Because for those of you who don't remember, Yuji switched with Kusakabe to learn Simple Domain, and switched with Yuta to learn Reverse Curse Technique, amongst some other things. And Gojo responds this by saying, well, yeah, it would have been fine if we switched, but Gojo Satoru hardly matters now. Gojo then goes on to tell Yuji that even if I die, I want you and the rest of Team Gojo to go on living. Even if I go out at the current strength that I am, I know that one day one of you will surpass me in strength. And thus Gojo wants one of Team Gojo to forget about him and surpass him in strength in a way that's different from how he was strong. And thus this plays into how Yuji deals with this no-name sorcerer, telling him, so long as you know that you've done wrong, use that information and atone. And once you feel as though you've truly learned your lesson, come and join us. Now this is obviously supposed to draw a direct line between Yuji and Gojo. See, Gojo always had a propensity for taking in lost children, whether it was Megami, Yuji, or even Nobara. All three of them came from pretty grueling situations, and all three of them found a parental figure in Gojo. And thus Yuji in a sense has inherited some of Gojo's strength. But strength isn't the proper way to explain it. The best way to explain it is that Yuji has inherited Gojo's dream. A dream where the up-and-coming sorcerers of the world won't be punished for their misdeeds, or at least won't be punished in a way unbefitting of the crimes they've committed. Gojo would rather these young sorcerers be nurtured and turned into powerful forces in the battle against evil. And that dream has now been passed on to Yuji. But Yuji didn't get Gojo's strength. That went to Yuta, as Yuta had to realize by switching into Gojo's body that just having Gojo's body wouldn't be enough for him to truly become the strongest. And now that he's back in his own body, he has to commit himself to becoming stronger than Gojo in a way differently than how Gojo was strong. That is to say that Yuta can't copy Gojo's strength. He needs to find his own. But if the entirety of the 17-page story that we were building out about this no-name sorcerer was to get us to that point, we could just as easily accomplish that point with the Remy is in America plotline. And in actuality, it would make more sense with her than this no-name sorcerer, as the core tenet of who Remy was as a character was that she allowed herself to be manipulated by every man in her life so that she could force them to do basically everything that she would want. Now, this led to her clashing against people like Megami, and honestly, before she's even really able to redeem herself, she's stolen by the American government. And thus, not only would Team Gojo takes a trip to America to free all of the Culling Game sorcerers who were captured by America be a good way to wrap up that whole plot line that was introduced for no real reason, Remy possibly being the catalyst who through her own motivations decides to help Team Gojo in the battle against the American sorcerers, or even just the American government who are trying to steal these sorcerers, and Yuji and Megami forgiving her even though they existed on opposite sides of the coin in the Culling Game could just easily be a way to show that Yuji has inherited Gojo's dream of bringing in lost and wayward sorcerers. And that's kind of the thing with the ending of JJK. You don't have to choose between closing out plot lines and passing the baton to the future. See, a lot of people talk about the ending of a manga and trying to close out plot lines like you're looking backwards. That, oh, if we're spending the entirety of the ending of this manga trying to talk about what was, we can't talk about what will be. But that's not true. That's just lazy writing. You can explore any theme you want to in any plot line. And so long as you're a good enough writer, it makes sense. On top of this moment acting as a send-off for Gojo is slightly disingenuous. And it borders on borderline disrespectful to a lot of fans. See, I get that it seems sweet for Yuji and Gojo to be laughing it up and talking about how Yuji's gonna overtake Gojo's dream and how one of the people of Team Gojo is gonna surpass him in power one day. But having Gojo's send-off revolve around Yuji, and Yuji alone, just doesn't hit right with me. Now, some of you are gonna say, but Nick, Gojo's had plenty of send-off moments with other characters like Megami and Nobara's letters, and the airport scene where he's with all of his dead friends. And yes, you'd be right, Gojo has had a fair amount of send-off scenes. However, characters like Maki, Inumaki, Yuta, Panda, Shoko haven't really gotten their chances to say goodbye. And when you know, as an author, that there's a massive contingent of people in your fan base that have been waiting for Gojo to return back to life, the very least you could give them is closure, especially when you consider a couple of the crucial things that Gojo said while he was still alive. See, Gojo, when he was released from the prison realm and hopped over to where Kenjaku and Sukuna were, told Kenjaku that he wanted to give Geto a proper burial. Now, this is one, because Gojo had a massive amount of love for Geto, and two, because of the obvious blunder of not sending Shoko to take care of Geto's body after his death. But now that Gojo is gone, Shoko is the last of all of the sorcerers from their class. And while Kenjaku's body might be up and walking around because Takaba willed it to be so, there was a fan drawing released on Twitter a couple of days ago of Shoko looking at her last ever cigarette as she says, "Well, it's not like I believe in the afterlife anyways, but I'm happy you two are finally back together. Idiots." And the final panel is Gojo and Geto's headstones right next to each other. That is all the fans needed. One page. And what's crazy is that in chapter 270, Megumi and Shoko were in a graveyard. Now, they were setting up Megumi's sister's gravestone, but why are we giving a send-off to Megumi's sister for not doing the same for Geto and Gojo, the two people whose bodies not only should have been taken care of, but also the two people who would undoubtedly want to be buried next to each other? While seeing Gojo say that Yuji is going to surpass him and that he trusts him with the next generation is an okay amount of closure, acknowledge the fact that one of the strongest relationships you've built throughout the entirety of your manga is Gojo and Geto. If you're trying to build out closure for either of these characters that are massively beloved, mind you, show Gojo and Geto buried, and maybe even bury next to Geto his two daughters. It's painfully simple, as the entire reason that they came back to Japan to battle against Sukuna is because they wanted to see Geto's body laid to rest. And yet, without ever really interacting with Kenjaku and Geto's body ever, they're kind of just brushed to the side the second that Sukuna's defeated. Did they get what they wanted? We don't know. Kind of the issue with this ending. We don't know anything. It's like Gege was given a timeline and he needed to finish the story in that certain amount of chapters. But so many plot lines and characters were just left hanging. The ending of the Culling Games, it just gets hand-waved. Maki meets up with a swordsman and the sumo guy and says that Jujutsu Society is hunting down reincarnated sorcerers so that those that they got reincarnated into can get their bodies back. And they say that there's gonna be a mission to go get the sorcerers back from America that were stolen during the Culling Games. But the Culling Games weren't built so that, like, when Sukuna or Kenjaku died, they ended. Now, we could probably make the argument because Tengen was vomited out of Sukuna that he no longer had the power to maintain the barriers that made the Culling Games essential, but we don't get told that. We have to assume that. And even then, it wasn't Sukuna who maintained the barriers. It was Kenjaku. So how did the Culling Games come to an end? We don't really know. New rules, binding vows, maybe? But it's not just plot lines like the ending of the Culling Games, America stealing sorcerers, Tengen not being able to maintain the barriers all across Japan, Geto's plan to turn all of Japan into sorcerers, to get rid of cursed spirits possibly being the correct plan or the incorrect plan. That didn't get fleshed out. A lot of characters that should have been fleshed out missed their chance. In fact, one of the biggest misses with the ending of Jujutsu Kaisen is kind of Nobara. See, Nobara was by far and away the most prominent female character in JJK, and prior to the Shibuya incident, she was objectively written perfectly. A character who didn't have to compromise her feminine desires in the pursuit of strength, showing that you can be girly and strong too. However, after the Shibuya incident and her head high five with Mahito's hand, she is effectively written out of the story, and not only is she not present, nobody really talks about her. And thus, when every other character who's still alive and kicking is progressing as a character in JJK, Nobara's quite literally sitting on ice. And over 100 chapters after her supposed demise, she comes back to life, which is awesome. She's my favorite JJK character. There's a reason I have a tattoo of her. But Yuji and Megumi and Yuta and so many other characters got to make massive leaps and bounds in their character development. And while one could argue that Nobara's final moments in the battle against Mahito were character development, even after she's returned to the story, she's still just goofing around like nothing's happened, as the same character that she was in the Shibuya incident. She's effectively made no progress as a character. No plot lines have revolved around her. And that kind of sucks, because while Maki absolutely picked up the slack for female representation in the story, there's absolutely no reason there couldn't have been two interesting women in this story. And there's also no reason that if we really wanted to keep Nobara out of the story for more than half of it, that we couldn't have, in the last 6 or 7 chapters that she's been back, progressed her character arc a little bit more. Whether that's her tackling the fact that she was killed and having some kind of fear response to that, reaching out to her mother and trying to mend that relationship because of the loss that she's dealing with a parental figure like Gojo now being gone, something she had had no control over and wasn't around to see, or so many other options. But instead, she was relegated to a relative non-factor in the story, and I find that unfortunate. But that doesn't mean that this ending is all bad. See, the leaks that came out prior to the official release didn't include any of Sukuna or Mahito's panels, and ironically, those are the best part of this chapter. See, Sukuna having a philosophical conversation with Mahito, the other biggest bad in terms of Yuji's life, where Mahito asks about whether or not Sukuna was lying about his true motivations in life just being to live how he wants and destroy everything that gets in his way. Genuinely, the best part of this entire epilogue is Sukuna acknowledging the fact that he had opportunities to get out of the way that he lived. See, because while Mahito believes that Sukuna lived the way that he lived because he was trying to enact revenge against those who tried to destroy him, and Sukuna rebuked that fact by saying it's all the same when it really boils down to it. Whether it was for revenge or simply to guarantee my way of life, I destroyed everything I laid my hands on, because that's my nature, and I know no other way. This moment, Sukuna realizes that no, that wasn't my nature. I could have chosen how I wanted to live, and that throughout his waking life, he had two opportunities to choose a different path. And those two opportunities were Yorozu and Urame, the woman who loved him, and the child he was a parental figure to. And thus Sukuna reflects and says, I had to vomit up the curse that lived in my entrails, because I was afraid of emulation through my own curse. Now, this is obviously in reference to Sukuna's true form that we saw when he was defeated. The goopy, sad little mud monster thing that apparently existed inside of the body of Sukuna. And thus, now that that curse has been vomited out of the entrails of Sukuna, he now, in the afterlife, acknowledges if he ever reincarnates, he'll change how he lives. And he does this while placing an arm around a younger boy version of Arame who he walks away with into the distance, presumably to the afterlife. And thus when Mahito yells at Sukuna, screaming about how it's ridiculous that he's gonna settle down, Sukuna in response says, well, of course. After all, I lost. And thus, the last two pages of this story have a significantly different meaning now that I know the context of the Sukuna and Mahito conversation. See, it's obviously fantastic to see all of the important characters from JJK happy, but the real important takeaway here is Sukuna's final finger. See, when Yuji was asked earlier in the chapter by Nobara if he got rid of that thing, he said yes, and don't worry, it's not dangerous anymore. If anything, it operates as the perfect ward. Now, prior to the exposition of Sukuna deciding to live his life in a more peaceful way, I wasn't entirely sure what this meant, but I now understand that what Yuji was saying was that Sukuna's last finger poses no real threat, and that instead it operates better as a ward against cursed spirits than as a threatening fifth of Sukuna. And this is hammered home by the fact that not only the cupboard, but also the box that Sukuna's last finger is in are left open, which is supposed to run directly counter to the fact that Sukuna's first finger that Yuji stumbled upon at the beginning of the story was in a closed box. Everything is left open because there is no threat. Even if Sukuna reincarnated, which he won't be the destructive king of curses that we remembered him as. And that, once you understand the context of the entire chapter, is a really good last page. It's actually a really good last 2 pages. In any story you love, you want to see everyone happy. You want to understand that the bad guy's been packed away. And I think it's really cool that Sukuna learned the lesson that Yuji was trying to impart to him. And thus, even though a lot of characters didn't get the time in the limelight that they deserved, and there's probably more open plot lines than closed ones, it's an okay ending. It's not the worst manga ending of all time, but it's not a good one either. It's fine. And that's still unfortunate because this manga deserved better than fine. And thus, that's how I feel. Would I have gone about it a different way? Yeah, absolutely. But can I complain with the end result? No. And I find that that's pretty much the community's response to the ending of JJK. In the beginning, it was easy to be furious, but as time passes, you begin to remember the things you loved about the story. No manga ending is perfect, and JJK is no different. I guess we should just try to be thankful for all the good memories that we've made with this manga up until this moment. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. Now that you've had a couple of days, if not weeks, to stew on the ending of the story, how do you feel about it? Do you feel better? Do you feel worse? Are you angrier? Are you happier? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. I lied. There is perfect manga endings. Full Metal Alchemist. I really like Fire Forces. I also really like Soul Eaters, but you get it.